We are working through a series where we are slowly breaking down and meditating on Psalm 23. Last week we did two things. Firstly, we looked at what a psalm is. These are poems and songs full of imagery which invite us to sit with them and allow them to provoke our imaginations and point our thoughts towards God. I also suggested that the Psalms were written during Israel's exile in Babylon, a time of isolation and hardship, as they were not in their land, as they were separated from their homes, and as they were unable to worship God in their temple. Now, I just wanted to clarify what I meant at this point, because to say that they were written during this time is actually unhelpful. I'm really sorry, I got it wrong. Before isolation, I picked up this book. It's a collection of letters written by various people from ancient times right up to the 20th century. But in 2019, when this book was published, all of these letters from across the ages were put into this one volume. Now, Simon Sebag Montefiore says that his aim in collecting these letters was to enlighten our past, to enrich the way we live now, and to illuminate tomorrow. In the same way, the Psalms were written across generations, reflecting different people's experiences from different times. These were then put together into one book, or a scroll, during the time of exile in Babylon, this season where normal life was disrupted and they were unable to be in their land. These Psalms were put together, I think, with the same purpose as this book, that these songs and poems, which we call the Psalms, would enlighten their past, enrich the way they lived then, and that they would illuminate their tomorrow. So Psalm 23 was not written during exile, but was included in the book during this season. Psalm 23, like most of the Psalms, was likely written by King David, a man who sometimes loved God and walked closely with him and ruled the kingdom with wisdom and grace, and sometimes had affairs and arranged for the death of the partner in order to cover it up. He was a man who knew hard times with regular threats to his life, the death of loved ones and betrayal. Often God seems silent and distant to him, so it makes sense for his poem to be sung during seasons of exile. The people were asking similar questions, I think, as we are today in our own season of isolation and difficulties. So last week, as well as trying to understand what the Psalms were, we also began to look at the first line of Psalm 23. This Psalm of David, which would later be sung by the exiles, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want." We reflected on where our provision, our security and our guidance comes from. We reflected on how we can learn to trust in God as the ultimate source of these things. And as we learn to do this, we realise that there is no better place that we can go than to him. He is the one that our restless heart is longing to find its rest in. So today, we're going to move on to verse 2, but before we do, let me ask you, how do you rest? If you had a free day and night ahead of you and lockdown restrictions were at last lifted, what would you do? What would make you feel rested? For me, my dream day of rest would involve a morning run through the hills where I live, followed by a big fry-up breakfast with friends and family. It would likely involve browsing through a bookshop and then hiding away for a couple of hours to read, probably with a hot chocolate in hand. There would be lots more food throughout the day, towers being built with Amos, and maybe a movie being watched at some point. Rest is important, I think. I think during this season of lockdown, this has been one of the things that many of us have been learning. We have been forced to slow down. It has become more difficult to work lots for many of us. Lots of us are getting outside more and taking notice of the nature that surrounds us. Because we are less in a rush, we are more inclined to stop and take notice of those things and people around us. Maybe we're even enjoying longer and deeper conversations with those around us as well. Or just simply to say kind words and a hello to those we pass. Now, this state of rest hasn't been possible for everyone. I'm deeply aware of the paradox in this very strange time. While many of us are staying at home and learning to rest, there are many others who are rushing around, creating policies, sourcing PPE, staffing our hospitals, creating vaccines, or just carrying on with the other essential work in increasingly difficult and sometimes dangerous conditions. We want to honour, don't we, our amazing NHS staff, particularly those who are sacrificially putting themselves at risk every day in order to save lives. I think Psalm 23 reflects this paradox. King David, who is writing, was a man who knew difficulties, who spent time on the run whilst being pursued by enemies. He was not able to be at home for seasons of his life because of the threats to him. Yet he learnt to hear God's voice leading him to places of rest, even during this experience of isolation. As we discovered earlier, Psalm 23 was put together and sung by those in exile, again, peoples whose normal life had been disrupted as they learnt to cope in the chaos and difficulties of exile. As they slave away for oppressive masters, you can imagine the people of God coming home and singing this psalm as a family and as a community into the evening. A psalm which reminds them of their shepherd that will lead them to pockets of safety and refreshment, even in the midst of difficulties. David writes, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul." How has God been leading you into rest during lockdown? How has he been speaking to you? And how can you recognise the voice of God leading you? What have you found helps as you learn to listen to him? Don't know if you know this about sheep, but it's basically impossible to make a sheep lie down. The only way you can make a sheep lie down is if the conditions are just right, that they've been fed and watered, and they're basically just chill out and lie down on their own. Here, the shepherd leads the sheep to the right conditions for the sheep to be comfortable and safe enough to be able to lie down and rest. Firstly, the shepherd leads them to green pastures. Now, in Israel, this is tough work. There are a couple of months of enough rain to create plenty of green pastures. The rest of the time, the shepherd has to work very hard to journey through the desert with the sheep to find patches of green so that they can be fed. Water also needs to be the right conditions. I don't know if you know this about sheep, but if the water is running too fast, they won't drink from it. Again, at great cost to the shepherd, it is up to him to lead the sheep, or even sometimes create the correct conditions of still waters. Some shepherds in Israel have even been known to make dams to still the water enough so that the sheep will actually drink from it. Once the sheep have been fed and watered and there are no enemies around, they feel safe, rested, confident that they can lie down, and they will, sure of the shepherd's guidance, provision and protection. But what did it cost the shepherd? The shepherd put themselves at great risk, wandering through the wilderness without their own protection. And the shepherd risked their own hunger and thirst in order to find food and water for the sheep. And this, David writes, is what God is like. God is the God who enters into humanity's suffering and hunger and restlessness to bring us, his sheep, to a place of rest. We see this in Jesus, who is our good shepherd, who, for our sake, suffered even by being humiliated on a cross, so that we, his sheep, might have life and have it to the full. Jesus is the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. We can now know rest in the knowledge that we are loved, that we are forgiven of our sins, that we are freed from the weight and the burden of those sins, and the knowledge that God's new future has begun, that the season of green pastures and of still waters is promised to us in the future, but can also be experienced now as we learn to hear the voice of our shepherd. But sometimes it can be difficult to hear his voice. There are so many voices from media, YouTubers, government, teachers, friends, as well as other faiths and philosophies. What voices are we listening to? And where are they leading us? As we learn to hear the voice of God, we are able to be led by him. And the Good Shepherd leads the sheep to green pastures. But the question is, how can we discern where God is leading us? And how can we hear his voice and know that it is indeed him? How can we be like those sheep that knew their master's voice? This is the question that I asked Jean, our wonderful vicar, this week. John, thank you so much for joining us. We have been looking at the Good Shepherd who leads the sheep to green pastures. However, our question is, we can't always discern where God is leading us. How can we know his voice? We wondered if you would be able to help speak into this for us.
Oh, hi there. Well, thanks for the invite. I don't want to pretend I'm an expert. I think everyone struggles listening to God. It's not a straightforward thing. Um, I suppose Jesus adopts that language from Psalm 23 and says, "My sheep know my voice." So there is an expectation we'll learn to do that. But it's really about trust, not technique. It's not like, yeah, I've got this sorted. I don't think it's ever sorted. Just like listening to my wife, it's not sorted. It's the relationship. I think that the things I would include in that are, at one time I used to be super spiritual. What's God saying? And now I wouldn't want to separate. All truth is God's truth. So if it's from the secular sciences, then or from the Bible, wherever it's from, if it's true, it's true. And so um, I've got a little Venn diagram, and I quite like when I'm trying to work out what does the Bible say about it. What does reason? Does this seem reasonable? And secular sciences, and then maybe tradition. What has the church normally taught about this? And when I'm making a decision, I think, well, where am I? And if I'm on a wild extreme of something, it might be right, but it's good to hold those intentions. So all truth is God's truth. But then the Bible, for me, is absolutely foundational. I love the Bible. I have gone through series of sort of opening it at random. And there's God has spoken to me many times, but the temptation is you think, oh, I don't like that one. Best of three, see if God comes up with something better. And the much better way of reading the Bible is to know the whole of it and say, well, what is the general picture? How has God dealt with his people through all time? And he's not going to be inconsistent and saying something to me that he's never said to anyone before. So holding it, not just proof texting one verse out of context.
That's so helpful. So, for example, if a young person was thinking about which university to go to, and they're discerning sort of God's call to that, to use kind of your diagram, they could look at scripture, look at how the church has taught about their future, and also think about what's reasonable and what's right
what makes sense
for them. Yeah, and I guess in that process, in that situation, they're going to perhaps not be thinking about here's the exact thing that God has called them to, but more about how to do this. I guess it's going to be more about who they are as they go to university rather than which university they go to as well, isn't it?
And I think the way God has made us, our own desires are part of God's leading. So I used to think, oh no, maybe God's going to want me to do such and such, when actually I'm in this job because I love this job. And God has wired me to want to serve him in a particular way. And in Philippians 2, it says, God is at work in you, inspiring both the will and the deed. And so if you're excited about doing something, if you want to read something at university, well, that's a God-given gift to notice that. I'd also, look at advice from others. I'd check out, are these people who know me well? Do they know God? But will they also say, no, you're daft, this can't possibly be God, and they love me enough to be truthful? So listening to people wisely and not just following, we're responsible for our own lives. And sometimes people have come to me, well, you're the vicar, tell me what to do. I say, no, this is your life. You take responsibility. But God's Spirit leads us in sometimes a very occasion I've had dreams that I felt were directly from God. Most often it's from the Bible. There's a verse jumps out and I think, oh, I think this is for me now. But I'd usually check it out with others, or there could be pictures, or sometimes I've just heard something on the radio and it happened actually this month. I thought, I think that's for me. I've got to attend to this. And somehow God notices, wakes me up to notice something. And sometimes we just have a hunch. I've been driving round and I suddenly pull into a road. I think I'm meant to go down here. It happened dramatically once, and there was a very vulnerable young person who was very ill mentally. And by the grace of God, I knew this person, and they'd actually got just come out of a secure unit. They'd broken out, and they were very vulnerable. And it really was miraculous. Just in the way I drove home, God led me. So I think it's trying to be open, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He'll direct your paths.
That's so helpful, thank you. And have there been times, other times, I guess, where um, you've had to discern what God wants for you, for your future or for your present?
Yeah, I mean, it happens all the time in little things. I suppose that, oddly, I mean, I think if you want to buy a biro, you can just go into a shop and try out lots. On the biggest decisions in life, you don't get to do that. So driving a car, you can test drive it maybe twice. Getting married, you only do it once. And I felt I was being called to, I wanted to ask Susan to marry me. And I thought, well, how do I know if this is the right person? Is there someone who's better looking or richer or will laugh at my jokes more? I don't know. What are the things I'm really looking for? And I spent a couple of days just trying to listen to God. And in that process, I think God did speak to me. But the bottom line is, can you live with your decision? And for me, there was a verse in Ecclesiastes 9 that I felt God spoke to me, but it's saying, do what you have in mind, whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might, because in the grave to which you're going, there's not going to be any of it. And even though it sounds depressing, it really helped me. I'm thinking, can I do this with all my might? If I'm half-heartedly doing something, probably shouldn't do it at all. And I thought, oh yes, it's not, is this the best person in the world, just as am I the best person in the world for her? The question is, can I make this decision and then live with it forever? And then actually that was very simple. Oh yeah, I can do that. I mean, I don't need to know the future. I just need to know this is the person I want to marry, and whatever, for better, for worse, richer, for poorer, sickness and health, uh, I will do this wholeheartedly. And if you can do something wholeheartedly, it's probably a good decision. If you're sort of saying, well, I can give it a go, but if it doesn't work out, that means you haven't really committed to it. So I think part of listening to God is also listening to our hearts and ourselves. Is this something I really believe? And when I hear people saying, well, I'll give it a go, I think, well, why bother if you can wait? If you don't really mean it, don't bother doing it.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. And again, what's so interesting in that, and particularly with God prompting you to read that Bible verse, is that it wasn't a verse that said, marry Susan. But again, it was about here is how I want you to go about making this decision. It's kind of
Yes.
actually God helping you discern your values and your motives for being
Yeah, and the
and doing, isn't it?
principles. Yeah, the values underneath it. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Thank you so much.